Okay, this is Mr. Cannon again, and we're going to be discussing Reconstruction in this lesson. Reconstruction is the period right after the Civil War. It refers to the period where the South is in complete devastation. Economically, it's in devastation because the plantation system has collapsed with the freeing of the slaves. Politically, it's devastated as those new those Confederate governments have to be replaced, and so they have to completely start from scratch there. Socially, it's devastated as the whole plantation system relied on planters really controlling social life in the South. And we've got 4 million newly freed people who are coming into free society that had never been a part of free society before. Physically, the South, of course, is completely devastated as well. And so we're going to look at what Reconstruction actually means and what it actually does not mean in the next slide. Talking about what Reconstruction, the purpose of it was, and what it was not. The first thing you need to know is that the United States government did not believe it was their role to physically rebuild the South. So when we talk about Reconstruction, we're not actually talking about the physical rebuilding of the South from the devastation of the war. Of course, we know from the previous chapter that Sherman has come through the deep parts of the South, Atlanta, Savannah, Columbia, South Carolina, and has burned and destroyed much of it. So we've got the plantation system is gone, farms are destroyed, buildings are in ruins, and yet the U.S. government did not see it as their role to rebuild it. They viewed that as a role of the individual states to do so. And of course, those individual states are devastated from the war as well, so it's going to be very difficult for them to rebuild. So what does Reconstruction refer to if it's not to the rebuilding of the South physically? Well, Reconstruction refers to the period where the government, the U.S. government, is going to rebuild the South politically and socially. Obviously, those governments, those Confederate governments in the South have to be replaced with governments that are loyal to the United States. And so how are you going to do that is the question. And we have over 4 million newly freed people in the South. People that were in slavery, that have never experienced freedom before, have never worked outside of a plantation before, have never been given political rights before. So how is that going to happen? And then, of course, you have a lot of whites in the South who are going to be hesitant to allow these newly freed people to have a rightful place in free society. And so that's going to be an issue that the U.S. government is going to have to figure out. How are we going to bring the South back into the United States politically and socially? And how are you going to protect the rights of these newly freed slaves when you have the majority of Southerners who don't want these newly freed slaves to have the same political rights that they have? You can see there in the photograph, in the picture, excuse me, that you almost have this, this government official here, this soldier who is between the two races there, and that's how Reconstruction is viewed by many people. And we'll get to that, why it's viewed that way here in a minute. Okay, we have two different plans for Reconstruction. We have the presidential plan of Reconstruction, and then we have the congressional plan for Reconstruction. So the presidential plan, which is really starts with Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, is going to be a very lenient plan. It is not going to punish the South nearly as much as the congressional plan is. Lincoln's view was he wanted to bring the South back into the United States as quickly and painlessly as possible. Now, the bad part of Lincoln's plan was that he was willing to not give as many political rights to African Americans as the radical Republican plan is going to demand. And the reason Lincoln is going to do that is Lincoln really wants to bring the South back in very quickly. Now, Lincoln's plan obviously is not going to pass because Lincoln is killed. He's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Let's talk about that for a minute. John Wilkes Booth was an actor, a very famous actor in America back then, and he's a Southern sympathizer who hates Lincoln and wants to see the South rise up again towards the end of the Civil War. It's quite clear that the South's going to lose the Civil War. Lee's army has already surrendered, but John Wilkes Booth comes up with a plan to basically decapitate the U.S. government. He wants to kill Lincoln. He and his conspirators want to kill Johnson, who's the vice president. They want to kill the Secretary of War so that the war cannot be conducted. And they want to kill, if they can, Ulysses S. Grant, who's the head of the Union Army. Booth is crazy. His view is that if he can kill these four men, if he and his group can kill these four men, that the U.S. government would be in such disarray that Lee's army can reform and the South can rise again, and it's a crazy plan, okay? And in actuality, the only part of the plan that works, unfortunately, is Booth's part, which is the killing of Abraham Lincoln. Booth is going to kill him by going into Ford's Theater. You know that story. He goes into Ford's Theater as Lincoln is watching a play, and at the biggest laugh line of the play, he shoots him in the back of the head. Lincoln lives for a few hours after that, but he eventually dies. And as a result, Lincoln is out of Reconstruction. Johnson, Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, becomes president, and his plan for Reconstruction is very similar to Lincoln's plan. It's pretty lenient on white Southerners. Johnson, however, is not nearly as powerful as Lincoln is. Lincoln is the man who's won the Civil War. So obviously, if he has a plan for rebuilding the South socially and politically, it's more than likely going to pass. But the radical Republicans in Congress are going to get a break. Not that they wanted Lincoln to die, but Lincoln's death is going to give them more power politically, because Andrew Johnson is not going to be nearly as powerful as Lincoln was. And so the radical Republican plan is going to be the plan that actually ends up passing. The radical Republican plan is a much more punitive or harsh plan on white Southerners. It's eventually going to take away many white Southerners' right to vote. Pretty much, if you participated in the Confederacy, your right to vote was taken away. And of course, most white Southerners did participate in the Confederacy, so most white Southerners are not allowed to vote during this period. It's going to force the South to pass all three Reconstruction amendments, granting African Americans full equality in America. And it's going to leave the military in charge of the South to protect those new rights of African Americans. So when you look at the radical Republican plan, it is actually much more favorable to African Americans than the presidential plan was. For white Southerners, they view the radical Republican plan as outrageous. That's why they called it the radical Republican plan. They thought it was outrageous, they thought it was unfair, and they desperately wanted the radical Republicans to fail. All right, so let's talk about those Reconstruction amendments. We've got three amendments that the South is going to be forced to pass in order to come back into the United States. The first is, of course, the 13th Amendment, which officially bans slavery in America. Slavery is no longer allowed in America under the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is going to grant citizenship rights to those African Americans who are now free, and in reality is to any person born in America or to an American parent. Now, the reason the 14th Amendment is necessary goes back to the Dred Scott decision. If you remember, in the causes of the Civil War, we talked about the Dred Scott decision. The Supreme Court ruled that African Americans are not citizens of America. That's one of the things they ruled in that terrible, awful ruling. Well, the 14th Amendment is going to fix that. What it says is that, no, it doesn't matter what your race is. If you were born in America or to an American parent or naturalized as an American, then you are granted full citizenship rights. In other words, you have equal opportunity under the law. You have equality under the law under the 14th Amendment, regardless of your race. religion, gender, it doesn't matter. 14th Amendment says you have full citizenship rights if you're born in America or you're born to an American parent. And then the last Reconstruction Amendment is the 15th Amendment, and that amendment's going to give all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. Now, ladies, you're not going to be there yet. That's not going to happen for you until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. But we do fix a part of the problem here with the 15th Amendment by giving all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. So we're on the right track. Not quite where we need to be, but we're on the right track with the 15th Amendment. Okay, so let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is a government organization that's going to come into the South and try to provide relief and assistance to the newly freed slaves and to poor whites. Now, it's going to do that by trying to provide education, which is desperately needed in the South, clothing, food, land, anything you can think of that the newly freed people would need as they come into free society. The Freedmen's Bureau did have some successes, and especially in terms of education. One of the reasons was it brought a lot of teachers from the North who were really wanting to help in the South. These teachers viewed themselves as missionaries when they came down South, and they poured their lives into these students. But for the most part, the Freedmen's Bureau was not successful. And the reason was it tried to do too many things. It was way too big. Its bureaucracy was way too difficult to navigate. You can see here in the picture, you've got these African Americans lined up trying to get this probably was a voucher for food, trying to get some food. And in many cases, these people were having to walk 10, 15, 20 miles, which takes a long time. And so what we were seeing in some cases is for the little bit of food that, these groups of people could get in a day, they could have planted or worked and been able to get the same amount of food just through working as they were able to get through the bureaucracy of the Freedmen's Bureau. So it wasn't very efficient. That was one of the issues. It just was not efficient. I don't want to say that the Bureau was a complete failure, because it was not. But the idea that the Freedmen's Bureau is going to provide 40 acres and a mule, which is what African Americans were promised at the end of the Civil War, that's not going to pan out, guys. That's not going to happen. So a lot of these African Americans are sitting here thinking, where's my 40 acres and a mule? I was promised this. The Freedmen's Bureau is supposed to deliver on that, but it did not. It did provide some relief. It did provide education. But for the most part, the Freedmen's Bureau was too big to actually be successful. Let's talk about new opportunities that African Americans are going to get as a result of Reconstruction. Now, obviously, the military being in the South are going to provide protection for the new freedoms that African Americans gain. And for African Americans, because they do have the right to vote, and now most white Southerners do not, that means that the new governments in the South, these state governments, are going to be run by African Americans. They're going to be run by freedmen. Now, they're also going to be run by groups of carpetbaggers and scalawags as well. Carpetbaggers and scalawags were whites. They're different in this regard. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who came south after the Civil War. Many of these people came south with bags over their shoulders that had all their stuff in it, bags made out of carpet. That's why they're called carpetbaggers. Most of them come trying to actually help in the South and want to provide new opportunities for African Americans. But some of the carpetbaggers do come just looking to make money off of the suffering of Southerners. So because you do have a group of carpetbaggers who come for pure monetary reasons, they're just trying to make money, they get a bad name in the South. And if you look at the political cartoon there, you can see how Southerners view these carpetbaggers. They view them very negatively. White Southerners especially view carpetbaggers negatively, and they resented them being in the South. And then, of course, the other group are called scalawags. Scalawags were viewed even worse than carpetbaggers because they were Southerners, white Southerners, who actually became Republicans and worked with these new governments. And they may have done it out of the goodness of their heart because they really believed in these new governments. Or for some scalawags, they did it simply because it was the political opportune thing to do. It was a way for them to gain power, in an era where they wouldn't normally have gotten power. But the majority of Southern governments are going to be made up of these carpetbaggers, scalawags, and freedmen. This is also the first time that African Americans are going to be elected to the U.S. Congress and U.S. Senate. So you're going to see the first African Americans from the Deep South be elected to Congress and be elected to the U.S. Senate. So now we have the state governments run by African Americans, and we see our federal government have the first African Americans brought into it. And these opportunities are going to be great for African Americans. Unfortunately, they're short-lived. They don't last a long time because as Reconstruction comes to an end, these Republican governments are going to be replaced by Democratic governments run by white Southerners again. But it is important to point out that for this brief period of 15 or so years, not quite 15, 12 years, we're going to see African Americans gain a lot of political power. And the governments themselves do a decent job, but there is corruption in some of these governments, primarily from the carpetbaggers, and this corruption is going to give these governments a bad name. We need to make it very clear that even though there was corruption in these Reconstruction governments, this was the fairest system we had seen in the South since the beginning of the country. So yeah, these governments may have been corrupt, but let's face it, when 5% of your population was controlling politics before this period, when the planners controlled everything, they're only 5% of the population. That wasn't exactly fair either. So even though the Reconstruction governments weren't perfect, they did provide more equality, which is important. All right, let's talk about sharecropping now. Sharecropping is going to be a way that many Southerners, both white and black, we focus on African Americans here, but the truth is many white Southerners also participated in the system called sharecropping. It's going to be a way for people who don't own land, and the majority of people did not, to make a living. You know, if you are coming from a plantation, you have very little skill outside of farming, you need to farm. Well, the problem is you can't gain access to land. It's too difficult. So you have to find a way to farm someone else's land, and that's what sharecropping is going to allow. Basically, you would have a landowner who would provide the land for you to live on. You are living on his land. Not in a good situation, by the way. You look at that picture there. That's a typical sharecropping experience. You lived in a shack. You would get your local mercantile or store to provide tools, seed, mule, anything else you needed to farm, and then the farmer would provide the labor. Now here's how it would work, is at the end of the year, the first half of the crop automatically went to that landowner. So the person whose land you're living on, he got half the crop right off the top. Another hefty percentage would go to the store because that's where you had gotten all your tools and seed from. You didn't have cash, so you had to take a loan from this store. So this store would take another healthy percentage of your crop, and they would actually take even more as what they would call risk money for lending you money to begin with, basically. And then at the end, the farmer would get what remained, and what remained was just enough to keep them farming another year. And it would keep people in debt for generations, guys. Basically, what sharecropping did, whether you were white or black, it kept you from being able to make enough money to buy your own land. And the system was set up that way because landowners were making lots of money off of this. Landowners made a killing off of this, and they didn't want you to be able to get out of this system. Now, I'm not trying to say that every landowner who participated in sharecropping was this evil guy who was trying to just make money off the backs of poor people, because that's not true. But there were a lot of landowners who were like that, and the system itself was set up to benefit the landowner at the expense of the farmer. So many of these landowners would make sure that you had enough to eat, that you had enough for the clothes for your kids, and you had a shack to live in. But after that, they didn't want you to make any more money after that. They wanted to keep you in debt, and you did stay in debt. And because the education system was so poor in the South, and you weren't forced to go to school back then, there were not what we call truancy laws that mandate you go to school. Many of the sharecropping families kept their kids at home to work. So they might go to school for a few years early in their schooling, like, first, second, third grade. But then many of these sharecropping families would pull these kids out of school and they would work because they needed them to work in the fields. And so if you're not getting an education and the family's not making enough cash to buy their own land, then you're pretty much stuck in this cycle of sharecropping for generations. So it would be passed down to the next generation, until finally somebody either got an education or they were able to get money somewhere to buy their own land. I know this system well because this is the history of my family. My family were sharecroppers from after the Civil War until my father in the 1950s was able to purchase land for the first time in my family's history since the Civil War. In fact, the only reason he was able to purchase land is he got a loan from a bank. A bank finally was able to finally agreed to give him a loan. Now, for many African American families, it's going to be even worse than that because my dad was able to get a loan in the 1950s, but for many African American farmers during that period, they weren't able to get a loan. So they continued in a cycle of poverty even after that. My family was fortunate that my dad was able to get that loan, buy land, and get us out of the sharecropping experience. But my father's father was a sharecropper. My great-grandfather was a sharecropper. My great-great-grandfather was a sharecropper. And that's how that system worked. It kept you in debt for generations. Okay, it was during this era that we are going to see the emergence of white supremacy. And that is groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other groups. That the Klan is not the only group, but the Ku Klux Klan is the most famous. They're going to emerge. Their primary motivation is to intimidate carpetbaggers, scalawags, and freedmen into voting the way they want them to vote or not voting at all, so that they can regain political power. Now, these groups, they had a lot of different motivations, okay? They all were about bringing whites back to power, but some of the groups were more violent than others, and some of the people in the groups were more violent than others. You had some in the groups that they just wanted to see Reconstruction end. You had other groups that would go as far as lynching African Americans, okay? So lynching is when you would tie someone up and beat them either to death or eventually you would hang them to death. And this happened throughout the South during this period. It happened all the way through the early 1900s and even beyond that in some cases. But lynchings were the worst of the worst for these white supremacist groups. It doesn't mean that every white Southerner who lived in the South, were violent. That's not the case. But it does mean that there were people who were. Okay, there were white Southerners who were violent, and even though the majority of white Southerners were not violent, they didn't stop it from happening. White Southerners as a group, if they had rose up and said this is unacceptable, then they could have stopped this, but they did not. And that's what makes it even sadder, that we see that people just sat back and allowed this stuff to happen. But these groups did range from people who just wanted political power to people who wanted to see African Americans killed. Okay, so you have a range of groups here. There were actually some white Southerners who were in the Ku Klux Klan that are going to come to regret the Klan because the Klan does become more violent as time goes on. In fact, the story goes of one of the early leaders of the Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, he says he was named for Nathan Bedford Forrest. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, who helped found the Klan, as the Klan became more violent, Forrest is going to have a religious experience in his own life where he becomes a Christian, and at the end of his life, he regrets how the Klan had become so violent against African Americans. So he actually goes into African American churches and ask forgiveness, and they do forgive him. I mean, that's just blows my mind to think that that would happen, but they do forgive him. And then the story goes that on his deathbed, he called for the Klan to dissolve. And even though the Klan as an official group did sort of go away for a while, white supremacist groups did not go away. They remained in the South for a long, long time, and are still, there's still white supremacist groups today. Now, the Klan itself did sort of disperse towards the end of Reconstruction and then reemerge as an official group in the 1920s. But I don't want you to think that these white supremacist groups went away and then came back. They didn't actually go away. There were still many white supremacists in the South throughout the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910. They still remained. As whites are going to begin to get more voting rights towards the end of Reconstruction, as more and more of these Southern governments are going to be allowed to reseat white people, we're going to see a group called Redeemers. These were Democrats, white Democrats, who viewed themselves as redeeming or saving the South from these Republican, freedmen, carpetbagger, scalawag governments. And so these Redeemers are going to take over towards the end of Reconstruction. At that same time, we're going to see laws passed and voting restrictions passed. They're going to take away a lot of the freedoms gained away. They're going to take them away. So even though African Americans during Reconstruction gain a lot of new freedoms, these freedoms are only going to be given with the Army protecting African Americans. Once the Army is taken out of the South and white Democrats come back to power, these new freedoms are going to be gradually eroded. They're going to be taken away, and they're going to be replaced by things like Jim Crow laws, which segregate society for decades, and voting restrictions, which make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. So even though technically they had the right to vote under the 15th Amendment, that right to vote is going to be short-lived in reality, as we're going to see African Americans voting less and less when Reconstruction ends. And that's what the civil rights movement is going to seek to fix. That's one of the things it's going to try to fix. Now, how exactly did this work? Well, let's talk about that really quick. All right, so the reason segregation, the black codes did not last in the South. Basically, the Reconstruction governments are going to come in, the radical Republicans are going to say, you got to throw those laws out. Those black codes are illegal. They violate the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But segregation laws, Jim Crow laws, are not going to be thrown out, because the Supreme Court in 1896 is going to rule that they are legal. And it's going to be in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. So you have this African-American gentleman, Homer Plessy, who in Louisiana, he refuses to sit in a segregated rail car. So basically, Louisiana had passed a law that segregated rail cars for whites and blacks. So blacks had one rail car and whites would have other rail cars. And I'm sure the white rail cars were nicer on this train. But Homer Plessy said, no, that's not right. I'm not going to do that. And so he was brought before a state judge in Louisiana who said, no, the law says that these cars are segregated. You have to sit in the black rail car. So he's going to challenge. Plessy challenges the law, and lawyers with Plessy challenge the law, and it makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, what they're going to argue, what Plessy's lawyers argue, is that it violates the 13th and 14th Amendments. That segregating society on race violates your constitutional amendments. And of course, that's correct. But the Supreme Court did not view it that way. The Supreme Court ruled that no, segregation does not actually violate the 14th Amendment as long as it's equal. So that's where the whole term separate but equal comes from. The Supreme Court said you can segregate society. Being segregated does not violate equal rights as long as the segregated facilities are equal. So separate but equal becomes the mantra in the South. Now, we know that they're not equal. That by separating schools and water fountains and restrooms and rail cars and seating on buses, that it was inherently unequal. That the schools, black schools, were not as well funded as white schools. That the black restrooms were not kept up as good as white restrooms. That the black water fountains were not as good as the white water fountains. And on and on and on. We could talk about all of these things and how it was not equal. But the Supreme Court ruled that it was fine as long as it's separate but equal. And so for decades, we're going to have segregation in parts of America. As Reconstruction is going to end, segregation, poll taxes, and literacy tests are going to be allowed legally in places throughout America. So we talked about what segregation was. Very quickly, poll taxes and literacy tests are what's going to make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. Poll taxes, of course, you would have to pay a tax to be able to vote. That would hurt people who are in poverty. Well, of course, African Americans, as a percentage, were more in poverty than whites, though it did still hurt many poor whites. The people in power didn't care. If they could keep African Americans from voting, they didn't care if it also kept poor whites from voting. Then they would pass things called grandfather clauses, which would say you don't have to pay the tax as long as your grandfather could vote. Well, of course, whites, their grandfathers could have voted, but for African Americans, that was before they even gained the right to vote. So that was another way you could bring in more whites and discriminate against African Americans. And literacy tests were very similar. You would have to be able to read a section to be able to vote. Well, much of the South, because education was not mandatory in the South, much of the South was illiterate and couldn't read. But then whites would be allowed to still vote if their grandfather could vote, called the grandfather clauses. So these things made it very difficult for African Americans to vote. And we're going to see this happen as Reconstruction comes to an end. Now, how Reconstruction actually ends is through a compromise. We're going to have a presidential election in 1876 where Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes basically tie in the Electoral College. So there's a tie. This has only happened a few times, guys. And what happens when if you have a tie, is the election actually goes to the House of Representatives. Well, in the House of Representatives, they couldn't decide who the president was going to be. They kept having vote after vote where it was a stalemate. And so finally a deal was cut. And that deal was cut between the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Southern Democrats. And basically what Hayes promised to do is he said, if you vote for me, Southern Democrats in Congress, if you vote for me, I will pull the military out of the South and end Reconstruction. And so that deal was cut. The Southern Democrats turned against their own candidate, voted for Hayes. Hayes becomes president, and in return, Reconstruction is going to end as the military is pulled out of the South. And the biggest negative of this, of course, is all those protections that African Americans had enjoyed during Reconstruction are going to be taken away. And we're going to see a lot of the equality that they had gained go away until the Civil Rights Movement.